Hello and welcome to How We Live Online. This is Christina. And before we get into the final episode of Season 2, I want to give some context for this conversation. For the past 2 years at least, I've been hearing about the possibility of a second civil war. And as you know, in this season, Joanna and I have been making predictions. Season 2 has been all about possible futures, internet auspices. What does the future of the internet look like, and how is that going to impact our society? Are we going to keep paying for like 50 different streaming services? Is society going to become Gattaca, the 1997 sci-fi film where Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman first met? And are sex dolls going to take over the world? We have a lot of questions and ideas about the American future. And for that reason, the Second Civil War is, I think, an apt topic for us to cover. So the thing that first got me to start thinking about the idea of a second civil war was this documentary called The Social Dilemma on Netflix that I think a lot of people watched when it came out, and I believe it came out in 2020. I just came downstairs while my parents were watching it, and there's the climax of the documentary with ominous music, shows one of the researchers saying, like, one of my biggest fears about this polarization on the internet, because the Social Dilemma documentary is mostly talking about how these AI tools are creating echo chambers on Facebook and YouTube most specifically, and how that contributed to the issues with the election. And I feel like the main takeaway that people ended up getting from that documentary was not that to get offline, but more like we are headed towards societal collapse. And so I'm going to play just that quick excerpt from the documentary. Like, it is the climax. Like, it's placed, at the 3/4 mark, and there's all the scary music playing. I just want to add those things into context, because I think that, like, including that moment at that point in the documentary was, like, an obvious choice. And to make that the climax, in my opinion, is fear-mongering.
What are you most worried about? I think in the shortest time horizon, Civil War.
And there's so much in that documentary that I do really believe in, that I do know to be true. This idea that, like, algorithms are pulling us farther and farther apart, that they're creating these echo chambers. That's something that Joanna and I have talked about so much on this season. And I do think, of course, that that is not a good thing, and that it is going to get worse. And I honestly think that this is maybe one of the only episodes in which we are not going to be predicting the worst possible thing that is going to happen. So since the January 6th attack on the Capitol, that has been something that has been widely cited as the beginning of an American Civil War, or as indicative of one to come very soon. And there are a lot of ideas as to how that second American Civil War will occur, either through immediate violence or more as a series of violent events that, when we look back on them, will declare this period in American history as a period of a second Civil War. And I want to make it clear that those are two very different predictions, and they mean really different things. One of them means that we are going to engage in warfare within this country, and the other one means that historians will retroactively declare that there was some kind of ideological war, and an ideological war is obviously very different than a physical one. And I want to add that through the conversations, just like conversations that I've had with people, in my life, I've heard about this idea of an online civil war that has to do with, like, crypto and Web3, wherein people are going to secede from American society and live solely within the online sphere. I don't know enough about that, nor do I think it's as pressing, because it feels like a more underground possibility. I want to talk more about the thing that is being pushed out on mainstream platforms, which is this idea of, like, a full-blown second civil war. And I want to add that thing about the possible online secession, because I make a quick mention of that in the following conversation, but we mostly talk about the possibility of a military or militia type war, as, you know, that's what a lot of this fear-mongering about a second civil war is focusing on. So in the following conversation, Joanna and I sit down with our friend and scholar Meredith Barber to talk about the possibility of a second civil war, and we'll just get right into it. Hello, and welcome to How We Live Online. I'm Christina.
I'm Joanna.
And we have a special guest.
I'm Meredith.
Hi,
Yay!
Meredith. Meredith is our ex-roommate.
Ex.
I love to say ex. I think it's hilarious. Joanna's my ex-roommate, too.
I like to say old flame.
Oh. I prefer fling.
Yeah.
Fling.
My ex-fling.
My ex-fling. You know, we saw each other for, in college.
What if you actually dated someone named Fling, though?
This is my ex-fling.
Yeah. Then it would get confusing.
Yeah, this is Meredith. Today we are talking, this is our final episode of the season, which is so exciting. Yeah, you didn't know. But, you know, it's the final episode of season 2 of How We Live Online, and we are going to be talking about the Second Civil War, which is a big thing that people on the internet love to discuss. And we have Meredith in because Meredith is a historian, and she knows so much about the Civil War, and we're going to let her introduce herself and give her credentials because, as a friend, I don't know what you do.
Oh, no.
I feel like that's just
Okay.
how it goes.
Well,
As a fan, I don't know what you do.
We're huge fans. This is young genius Meredith, who's on the pod. Anyway, so young genius, you could introduce yourself.
I'm Meredith, and my aspiration is to be a genius. Working towards it, getting my PhD in history. I am in my 3rd year of my PhD, and I study historical memory of the Civil War. So I study the way that people think and talk about the Civil War since the Civil War. I do also study like what actually happened during the Civil War, because in order to know how people thought about it, you also have to know what actually happened. But my like particular research interest is in education. So I research how people in schools talked about the Civil War, and like especially in segregation, because obviously people had incredibly polarized ideas of what the Civil War meant, depending on where they lived and also what their identity was. So like if a Black teacher is teaching about the Civil War to Black students, they're going to teach something completely different than a white teacher does to white students. But I try not to speculate about the future, because historians generally don't predict the future. They mostly reflect on the past and kind of try to figure out how we got to the present moment. So I'm not an expert in the Second Civil War, only the first one.
Sounds like a cop-out by historians.
A cop-out? What were you going to say, Christina?
No, I didn't hear what Joanna said. A cop-out?
I just made a joke. I said, sounds like a cop-out by historians.
Oh, yeah. We expect
Well, you get like academically excommunicated if you speculate about the future, because there's no, you can't do that.
Yeah, you're no longer a historian. You're doing what we're doing, which is
You're a pundit
really
or something.
You're doing what all these journalists / a lot of people on Twitter / everywhere are doing, which is like just saying over and over again, we're so polarized, we're going to get back to the Civil War times, which I think is much more complicated, of course, than as everything has been this whole season. It's much more complicated than that. So we thank young genius Meredith for coming on. I've been really excited about having you on, not just because you are my ex and friend, but also because you are the perfect person to talk about this with, because you listen to the podcast, you understand what we're doing, and you are very much knowledgeable about the Civil War, the first one, the American first one. How many books about the Civil War did you read this week, Meredith?
I read 10 about the Civil War and 3 about Reconstruction.
She's so smart, you guys. You could ask her anything, she'll know. You didn't say your research who you're working with.
Oh, I feel like not many people will know this, but are you talking about the other person?
I'm talking about Well,
Okay.
both. Say both. Say both.
I was gonna say Nina Silver, and no one knows who she is. She's just like a scholar of Civil War memory. But I also work for Ibram Kendi and do like research for his upcoming book about anti-racist and racist policies and how they shape our present world. It's basically about like how to unpack racist policies that already exist and also make anti-racist policies in the future.
Yeah. So you're doing that very cool thing of not only thinking about what has happened and being an academic about it, but also like doing the research to do something actionable, which is great. Yeah, and we don't expect you to make any speculations that will ruin your history career.
You can type it in the chat and I'll say it.
We'll easily
Like Meredith Barber.
Yeah, exactly. Barber. I love that.
Wait, you guys, that's so funny.
I know, it was such a good one, Meredith.
Yeah, Meredith Barber. Okay. So let's talk about. Well, here's some background. Okay, so the January 6th assault on the Capitol, the attack on the Capitol, was a truly insane thing that happened. And it's also this kind of major sign that a lot of political writers are pointing to talk about the Second Civil War. There's also people also like to talk about the Black Lives Matter protests and police violence used against protesters to talk about the possibility of a civil war. So we have that like kind of anarchist right attacking the Capitol, and then we also have like state violence against protesters. And these are two major things that people are using to point to a civil war, but also like just this ongoing conversation about we've never quotation marks, we've never been more polarized in American history, and we can only assume that this is going to spiral into a second civil war. I want you to give your definition of just what is a civil war first.
Well, I just want to preface this by saying it's my understanding of Civil War is very specific to the United States and also the 19th century. So, I mean, to me, a civil war is a group of people unified under some political or social cause, usually also unified by location of where they are. So, like in the US Civil War, it was North versus South, as we all know. And then one group separates from the state, which they see as illegitimate, and tries to form their own state. And then the state responds in whatever way they see fit. That's how I would define it.
Thank you. And then what do you think what would you say is the average person's understanding of the American Civil War? Like what do you think we all know about it? And then Joanna and I can say what we think about it too.
Okay. Okay. So this is a complicated question because I think everyone understands the Civil War differently because of its meaning to American people in general. And also the way that it's taught is so wildly different everywhere over the course of US history as well. So like somebody who's 80 years old might have a completely different understanding of the Civil War as me, or someone who grew up going to school in Massachusetts. Like a lot of my students don't know half of the things that I'm like, oh, remember in high school when you learned about this? Don't know what I'm talking about because I went to high school in Virginia. They went to high school in Massachusetts where they learn it from a completely different perspective. So I just want to say like it is definitely dependent on like your region and also your racial identity, I think a lot of the time, and also your family background. But I think most people, at least in the North, understand it as a war to kind of save the South from slavery. So I think it also usually like centers white people, white soldiers, white abolitionists, and it's like seen as this intervention into the South to end slavery for emancipation, which is more accurate than the South's portrayal of the Civil War, which a lot of like young students will understand the Civil War in the South as a war over states' rights and independence, something even like similar to the Revolutionary War almost, like this valiant war for independence to preserve the status quo, which was slavery. But I think like most people learn about the Civil War through these big figureheads. So like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, those are main figures in the Civil War. Maybe they'll think about like memorials or battlefields or something. But I think we have a really like strange perspective on that because we're from Virginia and we're from the DC area where it was also like a very hot spot in the Civil War. So we learn about it in a different way than other people do. Also, reenactors. I think people think about reenactments and that kind of thing too.
Yeah. We all went to William and Mary where there are not reenactors, they don't say that, but they say colonial interpreters, which I think is very hilarious. But yeah, Civil War reenactments, I think, are a big part of the memory of the Civil War, and also just like, to me, such a caricature of like, I don't know, American people who are America lovers or America files or whatever. Joanna, what do you think of when you think of the Civil War?
Okay, I'll say 3 things that I think of. 1, yeah, I agree with what Meredith said. Like, especially I think, you know, we all grew up in an area with a lot of military installations, so we knew kids who had grown up in a lot of different places and had a lot of different education. And I know, like, several times I, like, compared textbooks with people like after they had moved away and they were like, oh my gosh, like this is how it's described in this textbook.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a strange experience. Another thing that I think a lot about with the Civil War is something my dad would tell me, which is essentially like, so my grandpa was born in 1920 and I was essentially born in the year 2000. Like if you round, it was the same amount of time from when my grandpa was born to the Civil War, from me to World War II. So, like, that always just, like, struck me as really interesting that, like, it, like, just as, like, touch points of, like, how long ago history was.
Yeah.
And, like, not, I mean, it's both, like, long and short, you know?
Yeah.
And the other thing that's crazy about the Civil War is like how far they had to walk. Like Meredith says they were close together, but like not separated by location, but like literally, can you imagine like walking all that way? Like I drive, like I like visiting the battlefields.
Like I drive.
Because going and walking. Horse. Did they all have horses?
No.
But literally, it's so far. Like, can you imagine?
Walking to Atlanta? Sherman's March to Atlanta.
Like,
I don't know actually,
wild.
but they walked really fast. But even more, like walking from DC to Richmond would be kind of crazy.
Right. And like that, like those things are like things that I feel like a lot of war for me personally is just like hard to conceptualize. Like even modern war, let alone like historic war. It's like just hard to conceptualize or like think about.
That is the job of historian.
Oh my God.
They can think about the actual lived experience of something like that.
Yeah, the American Girl doll book on the Civil War.
Is
there one that exists?
Patty?
Wait, is there one that exists?
Patty would have lived through the Civil War. That would be way too contentious for them to write about.
Yeah, I'm kidding. I don't think they did that. But imagine. It would be so inaccurate. Yeah, the walking thing, that is very hilarious. But true. And it also makes you think about, like, wars fought on the ground between people and not any kinds of, like, drones or airstrikes. That is really crazy, and just a different way for war to happen, even though like so many people died. I am assuming that we are committing, Meredith is nodding, way more people are dying now from war. Yeah. I mean,
Actually, I don't know if that's true.
Is that true? Well, civilian deaths.
The death toll that the Civil War took on the United States was bigger than any war that the United States ever participated in by a lot. Like,
but on the US, or like everybody who died in the war.
Like, the Civil War is the most deadly war that the United States has ever had, for soldiers and civilians. Is that what you mean?
I mean, like U.S. soldiers and U.S. civilians, or like if you're comparing it to like the Gulf War, like.
Oh, and people who died at the hands of U.S. violence. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure of that comparison, but it was like the Civil War was complete destruction, especially in the South, of everyone's like entire lives, and then afterwards there were like pandemics, epidemics. And like there's no infrastructure to take care of anything. There was no state power, so like people just kept dying en masse, to put it lightly. Like, it was really, really tragic.
I believe that, but also like that. How is that something that I didn't realize? You know, I don't know.
It's because it's portrayed as this like cool, interesting part of U.S. history that Civil War buffs want to chat about and be excited about. It's not portrayed as the actual like terrifying, disturbing, upsetting thing that it actually was. I think.
And I feel like the reenactments like kind of turn it into a sport, like a team mindset. Yeah. The only thing that I think of that hasn't been said, just because we have, I think, similar experiences our education around the Civil War because of where we're from. I remember someone telling me who was like from Virginia Beach or Norfolk saying that they learned about the Civil War, maybe it was like a cousin, and it was called the War of Northern Aggression, which within the same state, that's a majorly different take on the war. It's it was given a completely different name. And I also, even what you said, Meredith, about like what Northerners think of when they think of the war as like a Northern intervention in the South, like I never thought of it that way. I still think of it as like the South leaving, but like for not a good reason. Which is interesting. Yeah.
I think that's interesting because as Virginians, I think it was drilled into us that secession was legitimate. But in the North, it was never seen as legitimate. So it's not taught as legitimate. So it's taught as like an intervention against the South's will, not due to a legitimate secession, which is just like a basic fact of the Civil War that we're not really taught explicitly.
Yeah, I think my brain idea about that is not due to like my initial understanding of the Civil War, but because of one specific teacher who made, and I don't remember who this was, who made us, and maybe Joanna, it was in high school and you remember, who made us like close read so many different speeches from Abraham Lincoln, like every single one, and then like talk about the reasons behind, and it wasn't even a rhetoric class. Like I really think it was a middle school class. Oh my god, who was it? Whoever did this for me, thank you. They like made us read, huh?
It would have been Feeney.
All right, I don't think it was
only
him.
That's the only
American
you don't learn about Civil War in 6th or 7th.
Maybe it was Mr. Obed.
Or no, yeah, not 6 or 8. Yeah,
I don't know. For the two people who know who we're talking about, send in your ideas. But yeah, we had to like close read a bunch of Abraham Lincoln speeches, and then not like take what he said at face value, but like try to understand why he would be saying things that way. And I just remember the class kind of ending up in more nuanced discussions about that sort of thing that I hadn't had before, which is pretty interesting. And I'm bummed that like I don't remember anything else about it, but I do remember like having to sit down and like barely being able to read the fucking like copy that they gave me of the of the address, and like not really understanding what I was doing until the end. But that is to say, the way that we teach it like is so different across the board, and that was time spent in the classroom taken out of time that should have been like preparing for the standardized tests, when like nothing that I learned in that unit was on whatever standardized test I had to take. But yeah.
Sounds like a genius history teacher. They're making you engage with primary sources directly.
Yeah.
Probably teaching you how to do a DBQ.
Was it like debates or was it electoral stuff? Do you remember?
It was like not every single one, but it was a lot of like addresses that he made to just like on his campaign trail time, whatever.
1960 or 1859.
1859. Yeah, I don't know who it was, but yeah, good teaching. I'm gonna move to the next thing if you want. What do you think?
We're not about Robert E. Lee.
Oh, you want to talk about Robert E. Lee?
Well, I'm unless you guys had different educations than me in Alexandria versus Arlington, which Robert E. Lee is from Alexandria and Arlington, so he was like our king in Alexandria. And I remember really explicitly learning in 4th grade that Robert E. Lee was allegiant to his state. He didn't support slavery. He was a states' rights man. He was a military genius. He fought for an honorable cause. He like lived out the rest of his life happily, and people didn't hate him afterwards.
I do remember that part. I think that we got a lot of... I went to Arlington Science Focus School, and I guess like everyone was just really into like the facts. I don't know. I don't remember. I do remember like them being characters of the, and like very much representative of each side equally. And we went to Robert E. Lee's, where did he live? His estate. Cemetery? No, didn't he have a house? Doesn't he have a house that
cemetery?
You can visit? At Arlington Cemetery.
Oh, I didn't go to that. But I don't know.
There's
Maybe
one
I'm thinking of, because didn't he have like a whole, like, you know how you can go to Monticello? Is there not a Robert E. Lee version of that somewhere in Arlington?
At the cemetery, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't remember if because I felt like I haven't been to Arlington Cemetery, but maybe I have.
It's not like, it's a little bit separate from the cemetery.
Then maybe.
But you probably would remember. He was one of the guys on the SOL.
What's up?
He was on the SOL, like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Robert E. Lee are on our 4th grade SOL.
Standards of learning for non-Virginia residents. That's what that stands for. Not shit out of luck.
I wonder if he still is.
That's a good question.
We should ask our friend who tests the SOL questions, or whatever Sean does.
Texas. But he does Texas ones, I think.
Oh.
But I mean...
That's supposed to be interesting.
Sean, get on here right now.
Join the call.
I'll go knock on his door.
Oh my god. Oh. Now I want to go on a tangent about Sean. What was I going to ask? Oh yeah, okay. Next, Meredith. What do you think is a major factor of the war that gets overlooked? Like something that you think that isn't common knowledge. But I guess what we've established is everyone has very different common knowledge about this war, so.
Yeah, I'm actually so excited to answer this question. So I think there are 2 major things that get overlooked about the Civil War. One of them I might be biased about because it's literally my field, but like I think that people overlook how narratives about the Civil War were adjusted and changed like immediately after the Civil War. So basically, like at Appomattox, at the surrender, people literally, like soldiers, Confederate soldiers, literally abandon Lee's army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox because they refuse to believe that the war is actually over and that they actually lost the war. So then this narrative that like the South was not legitimately defeated, that they were fighting for an honorable cause, not slavery, that they were fighting for independence, that for states' rights, for like their manhood or whatever, that they lost because they were completely overpowered by the US government, that like there was strife, intersectional strife within the Confederacy, and like ran out of resources basically. But the reason they were defeated was that they did not have military power, and they like literally strategically also lost the war. And they also expected that enslaved people within the Confederacy would support the Confederate cause, which is like obviously extremely stupid because enslaved people wanted to be free and like themselves helped spark the war. So then when that falls apart and enslaved people start flooding away and becoming free, the South loses like horribly. The South took a major S, some people could say, but like so quickly, especially women made these memorial associations. You guys are probably familiar with United Daughters of the Confederacy, to preserve this memory of the war as like less horrible than it actually was, as a war of northern aggression, as like a legitimate war that I think lasts through to this kind of fear of the Second Civil War, and also lasts through to the people like neo-Confederates basically who want to incite a second Civil War are doing so on behalf of the lost cause, which is what I've been talking about. It's broadly called the lost cause. And they kind of want to get revenge for their lost cause. And I think that if the Union Army had really like crushed that dissent initially, which they avoided doing because they thought that it would kind of destroy the legitimacy of the Union in the South after the Union victory, I think that we wouldn't be dealing with that. And a lot of historians, I think, see that as kind of a sad part of the end of the war and Reconstruction, that like it had so much opportunity but failed a bit in that way, and that there's still this idea of the lost cause that exists in our public mindset today.
It's so interesting, like, to think about how, because essentially you're describing, like, I mean, it's not a miscommunication, but, like, essentially, like, it is. And it's one of those things that I'm like, oh, that's crazy. Like, how could that even happen? But then it's not to say for the first time in the episode that maybe we'll say it again, that history repeats itself. Because, like, it's so crazy how that happens all the time. Like, it's just like how we can't even get a grasp now, right, on how to properly communicate things, or like control of narrative, like, is still a crazy thing. I don't know, that's what I'm thinking about, is like, because I'm like, dang, like, there was nobody there, so obviously something like that would happen. Like, you could spin whatever stories you want because you're all just going off into your own corners, like telling people, but really it's like an organized effort, like what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, also, how were people supposed to know how the Confederates lost the war if, like, the little Confederate soldiers are walking off to their tiny rural town in the middle of Tennessee and being like, this is what happened, and everyone obviously believes them because nobody has any other reference other than, like, the 2-week mail.
Oh my god. I mean, obviously it's something that I knew, that the spread of information was so much slower, but I think it's so interesting because we have this idea now that, like, because of the way that we can communicate so quickly and with such, like, fervor and energy when we're mad or whatever, and reach such a broad audience, and then, like, spin whatever narrative we want as soon as possible, and that's the spread of misinformation now. The spread of misinformation in the 1860s was like, I'm gonna tell my people my story, and they're gonna believe it.
This war ain't over.
This war ain't over. Wait, do you mind just, like, quickly summarizing the Lost Cause?
Okay, so the Lost Cause is the idea formulated by mostly Southern women, but also Southern Confederate veterans, and also, like, people like Jefferson Davis, so these big policy makers, heads of the Confederacy. So those are the people who kind of formulate it. And it's called the Lost Cause because it's the Southern cause framed as something valiant, honorable, and justifiable that was lost. And it's kind of a way to justify all of the death and destruction that occurred in the South by saying, like, we were doing it to defend our states' rights, our independence, and our valor and manhood as the Union, like, infringed on all of these things. And it very intentionally excludes any discussion of slavery. And when slavery is brought up, it's within that, like, good old days, antebellum, like rosy antebellum era narrative. So, like, slavery wasn't actually bad. We were all nice to each other. Enslaved people loved being enslaved. They loved their work, it was literally an intentional lie made by these people to justify what had just happened.
Yeah. Why do you think, you've mentioned manhood a couple times, and that's something that I've, like, never associated with the Civil War, but I guess I have associated with war. What do you think is the reason? I mean, was that a specific thing that, like, the Daughters of the Confederacy / is that a specific thing that, like, they talk about now? Is, like, masculinity? And is that a pairing of masculinity and, like, respect or, like, strength? Or is that, I don't know, I'm just curious about that.
So I think I've been talking about manhood because, like, a lot of historians understand secession as kind of like an assertion of these men's masculinity at the time, because they saw their role as enslavers as kind of like their access to manhood, and, like, expressing domination over women and enslaved people, your household, in quotes, was what made you a man. So then when Lincoln becomes president and they feel like slavery is threatened, they're like, oh no, we can't be men anymore. I guess we have to secede. And some Southern women don't buy into it, but most do. And I think that's, I don't know if it's like still discussed in UDC, United Daughters of Confederacy, today, because I don't really know what their narratives are today. They're a little bit more on the fringes. But it was through the 1960s because desegregation.
I haven't thought of it that way. I guess I also, like, this is, like, the first time I've been thinking about the Civil War this deeply in so long. But yeah, and that just, like, brings me back to gender studies classes of, like, you know, that racial / gender hierarchy of, like, white man is, or the totem pole, like, white man is at the top, then white women, and then, like, white women want to keep that spot as close to the top as possible, so they do obviously have a stake in, you know, these racial hierarchies, these class hierarchies, and gender hierarchies, because if they can, like, link themselves to the head of household in that way, then they'll stay safe and stuff. That's really interesting. I also didn't know that, like, they were such a big part in upholding that narrative, but also I think it makes sense as, like, I don't know, just, like, the women's role in, like, storytelling about like family history, I guess.
Mhm.
That's interesting to think about.
The second point, things that are not commonly known about the Civil War, should I say it?
Yeah.
That I think is very relevant to this
Yeah.
discussion. The expansion of the state that came after the Civil War and during the Civil War. Like, before the Civil War, there was not as big of a US military. There was a weaker postal system because people didn't have to get information around as quickly. There had not been like universal education, but then when enslaved people were freed, so many schools started to enter like state constitutions, and I guess they weren't federally funded, but there became a more national school system. Literally, like, so many people died during the Civil War that a federal commission, the United States Sanitary Commission, had to be established to identify bodies of people. So like medical commissions were established through the federal government, and like military reconstruction, the military had to occupy the South. So there's just like huge expansions in state power, even to like reconstruct bridges and stuff. They have to be federally funded. That was completely unprecedented before the Civil War, which still exists today. The state has been expanding since the 1870s, I think. And I think part of that is to make sure that there is never a Civil War again. So, I mean.
Which leads me to my next question. What do you think, or what have you seen? You don't necessarily have to give an opinion because that maybe would lead to speculation. I don't know. But what have you seen about a second Civil War? And like, just what's your initial reaction to that?
The stuff I've seen about a second Civil War is probably most importantly that like this is the most divided that we've ever been, and we are on the brink of chaos, only to a degree, or like to a degree that would only be reflected in the Civil War, which I would like to strongly disagree with. I think saying that we have the most sectional strife that we've ever had is like simply wrong. Like literally 4 million people were enslaved at the time of the Civil War. Like that is pretty intense division.
Yeah.
I think when people talk about like we have never experienced this level of division before, they're talking about white people. Like,
yeah,
maybe white people haven't experienced this level of division before. I don't know. But if you think about like conflict over slavery, and then conflict over the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, like desegregation, the Jim Crow era in between that, all of that would be way more serious sectional strife or just like division in the country in general, because it's literally like white people stripping rights away from people of color in general, which obviously exists to a degree now, but ignoring that, first of all, diminishes the things that people went through, like people of color, specifically Black people, went through in like all of the years before now, but also like makes it just stokes fear. Like it makes people think back to this really horrific time of the Civil War that is not being replicated now at all, really.
I'm just really thinking about that. Wow, that is so... everything you say, I'm like, oh my god, I've never thought about it that way. But Joanna and I both made the same face of like, oh shit, true. When you said, when you're talking about division, there's never been more division. You're talking about the division between white people. And that, I think, really speaks to at least what I've been seeing, which is a lot of like, what do I do about my parents who are Republican? Or what do I do about like that one uncle at the dinner table who like who loves Trump and like says this terrible shit? And that is obviously such a different degree of division than like an entire race of people being enslaved for a certain amount of time.
1619 to 1865,
Yeah.
more than 200 years.
Yeah.
Historians are bad at math. One historian that I often disagree with, but I do disagree with in this case, like
that you
wrote,
do agree with in this case?
yes, but
Okay.
Gary Gallagher, I disagree with all your other work. But this guy's name is Gary Gallagher, and he is a historian of the Civil War at UVA.
Mhm.
And he wrote in an article about like the Second Coming of the Civil War, no political issue in 2022 approaches slavery in terms of political explosiveness. So he's not even talking about like the political views of the enslaved. He's talking about like the sectional strike that it caused within white people, which also was way more dramatic and intense, I personally believe, than things that are happening now. Like, literally, you guys, I mean, I don't know if people are familiar with this story, but Charles Sumner caned on the Senate floor, like almost beat to death by Preston Brooks in congressional chambers. And
I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Like, I don't know. Joanna, do you know what she's talking about? Have you heard of?
I've heard of Charles Sumner.
Okay.
I've heard of Fort Sumner.
Story. A very dramatic story.
Okay, yeah, tell it.
Charles Sumner, a New England senator, I believe, says that Preston Brooks's cousin only wants to protect slavery, and that's why he supports some political issue. A couple days later, Preston Brooks comes storming in because he feels like his cousin's honor has been trashed or whatever, and literally beats Charles Sumner until he's about to die. And he only like stops because someone intervenes or something like that.
With a cane?
With a cane. And there was blood all over the floor. It was really disgusting. In the Senate, in the like Senate chamber. And I mean, also like Lincoln literally got assassinated.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Those things are not happening.
Yeah. I personally have never organically seen any Second Civil War content. I don't know if that makes me a bad person. That like I don't.
No, it makes you worse than us. Yeah.
Yeah. But one thing I do know about is public opinion polling, which I think is a source of like this idea that there's more division than ever that we've been talking about. Like, at least that's my frame of reference for it, is like, so public opinion polling, literally asking people like, do you think we're more divided than ever? Or asking people about their opinions and like showing division that way. Which I think that there's some truth to that, but also if you're asking people like what they think, like their opinion, it's it's not necessarily reflective of the truth. Like, I think it could be the case that like some, like maybe we are not, certainly we are not more divided than ever, but certainly people could also think we are more divided than ever. And that also has great implications, which I think is just interesting to think about. But yeah, no, I totally agree with what you're saying, Meredith. Like, and I think so, obviously it's not a unique or original take to say that like so many of the ways and the narratives that we have about our history are written from this specifically like white perspective. Like, even as we're discussing, you know, the deadliest war in the history of the United States on U.S. soil, I was thinking how many, you know, indigenous Americans died on U.S. soil at the hand of U.S. or like due to disease spread by, you know, people trying to settle.
Colonizers.
Yeah.
Invaders, some might say.
Right.
Yeah, there's the Social Network documentary that has this kind of like central thesis that social media is driving us apart, which like to a degree I believe that. Yeah, like our algorithms, and we've talked about this at length on the podcast, and just anyone who uses an algorithm based thing on the internet understands that like it takes information from us and it vomits it back out, and we become stuck in this echo chamber. I believe that that is true because it is true, and I know that it's true.
I was going to say, I think even though there, in my opinion, would not be a replica of Civil War as Americans understand it, I think that it is legitimate for people to feel unsettled and afraid by the political moment that we're in, and also just like the way that the internet stokes that and that media stokes that and really like does, I think, make sectional division worse. And like there's a rise in the militia movement lately. There has been secession attempts, like allegedly by California and Texas, that are unprecedented. Like that is a reason to feel fear, I think. But I think invoking the words civil war in the United States means something very intense and different to Americans than it does in other places, to people in other places. Like I was talking to my friend about this today from England. She's from England. And she was like, of course, I think that's a possibility. Like that happened with England and Ireland. And she started to explain basically the troubles and the terrorism that came along with that. And that is obviously completely different than the American Civil War, but is kind of like a modern form of violence against the state, I guess I would say.
Or any
could happen.
Central or South American Civil War that was a civil war because the United States intervened and wanted to change a government.
Yeah.
Just had to make that clear.
Just throw in some extra civil wars. Joanna was using quotation marks Civil War. I think like the idea of like invoking the Civil War is so dangerous because of the way that we react to that. Like, oh, you're saying that like the deadliest war that we've had could happen again. But I also like want to say, and I think this is something that people do understand, but like no militia can stand up against the US military. That's never gonna happen. That's literally never going to happen. And so there are like these two crazy ideas about a second Civil War. There's one that's like the right and the left are going to like come head to head in some kind of like violent war, militia type war, which doesn't totally make sense to me given the fact that we have the US military and like that shit will never happen. And then this other idea that like the Civil War is going to be like an ideological war that like doesn't ever have violent. It's like an internet sensational war in which like there's no physical violence attached to it, but like people become so, I don't know, there's this idea that like people are going to start only using crypto as their currency and then like create their own kind of like online world in which I guess their computers are in America, but like they're in their computer. And I don't think of that as a war either. So yeah, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask you if they thought it was basically like a Cold War, but you have made it clear that they're basically just going to act as separate states within the internet. That doesn't really make sense because obviously there's like interstate commerce.
It's like something that I just can't wrap my head around because I don't understand how. I think the idea is like living your full life in the metaverse and then like you've seceded in that kind of way, which
I will say, like, to me it is a fair assumption given how lawless the internet is that you could operate without regard to the United States government on the internet because in a lot of ways you kind of can. But yeah, still like in your physical being, when you go to buy food
Mhm.
for yourself,
Mhm.
you will be paying taxes on it.
Oh,
You gotta
So
be homesteading.
didn't think about
Then
that.
don't you pay
Farm
taxes on
bill.
your land?
Mm-hmm.
I guess
Where do
not if it's
people
farm
live?
bill.
I don't know.
They just don't live in a physical space.
No.
No, they're just in the
it's-
metaverse.
It's
They don't need food.
bleep. That's me spoiling a movie that I won't spoil.
What?
I'm not gonna spoil it.
Gattaca?
No. We talked about it on the show. I'm not gonna say it.
I don't know what you're saying.
Maybe I narrowed it down enough for people. No, I didn't.
No. All right.
What
Well,
are you talking about?
If
I
you
can't
know,
think
you
of it.
know. If you know, text me.
actually, Joanna's number is
Bleep.
and then I want to ask Meredith just generally because I think it's interesting. What do you think of the phrase "history repeats itself," especially like in the context of the Civil War?
History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
What?
Whoa.
Whoa! Do you say this
That's
to
what
your
the
students?
song say. No, I've
Mic
never
drop.
said it to my students, but this is what I have heard. This is a great little story that I think is very accurate about the practice of history. So, I don't think history repeats itself, but I do think it informs the present moment and it can explain why we live like we do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you went into a coma and you forgot everything about your life and then you woke up, somebody would have to explain it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone would have to explain your life. That is the practice of history. Because then, like, if your friend is mad at you, someone will have had to explain why your friend is mad at you to you, and then you understand why you are existing in that moment like you are.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it repeats itself, but I think it explains our moment.
Mm-hmm.
And people love to say that it repeats itself, but just whenever it's similar. But obviously it doesn't repeat itself. It can't.
What about Groundhog Day?
Explain that, genius.
I'm
Yeah.
just gonna take the genius part out of that. Me?
Really? I guess, like, yeah, this idea of history repeating itself it's really interesting to think about it in terms of, like, I don't know exactly what happened in the Civil War, and I don't know exactly what happened up until then. But there are people like you who are not only looking at, like, primary sources from when the thing happened, but also, like, all of the communication about it between then and now. And so, like, you're not only informed by what happened in the past, but also how we've been talking about that past for ever since it happened.
Yeah, I mean, the internet exists now. That does completely change anyone's experience of war, like, and how they think about their relationship with each other. That, like, during the Civil War, someone could have been a lot more separate from a person that they were fighting against, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you tried to exactly replicate the Civil War now, it would not work at all. It would be completely different. Like, reenactors can't do it, and they try their very best.
I mean, like, seriously, what the fuck would they do? I mean, because it's a game. Like, they're LARPing. And, I mean, like, they are literally LARPing, but, like, to accurately represent the thing that happened, like, you would need a lot of different characters playing some really, really fucking sad roles. You know what I mean? Like, if you wanted to really have... Do they hire, like, people to act as enslaved people?
That's very contentious in the reenacting community.
Don't you want it to be accurate?
Well, that is a big controversy in colonial Williamsburg. Did you know that?
Oh, yeah,
Like,
to have
whether or not they're hired, like, if they can hire, I mean, obviously they can't not hire Black workers, but, like, what their position in colonial Williamsburg is going to be. And then Black workers in Williamsburg and in any historical site around the US South are always asked, like, oh, are you a slave here? And it's just like, really demoralizing for them to work in those positions. But
yeah, even just like people working there, you mean?
yeah, like
Yeah.
my coworkers working at Monticello, people used to ask him all the time if he was like reenacting an enslaved person in Monticello. It's just like
And he
literally.
was probably wearing like khaki shorts and like
Yeah, he'd wear like a bow tie and preppy outfit.
yeah.
It's like, what the fuck?
That's like the worst fucking joke.
Yeah,
you
but
could possibly
I
make.
guess back to seriously, back to your question, like you literally can't reenact this stuff without, like, I think ethically you can't reenact it because if you were going to reenact it, you would have to die. like
A huge percentage of everybody would have
suffer from smallpox and like malaria.
Mm-hmm.
Are you willing to do that, Mr. Reenactor?
And then finally, why do you think history matters? What's your elevator speech on that?
Well, I think history matters because it can explain our present moment. Like I was saying, I mean, at least when I think about like the research that I do on racist policies, I think history matters because if you like look back at a policymaker writing a policy that we might not think of as racist today, and I go back and read it in the congressional record and they say like, I don't want this to help Black people. And then today, Black people might be more susceptible to like harmful student loans, basically, or go into a lot of debt from student loans. And then you go back into the congressional record and you look what people are saying, and they're saying literally like, this is made for white people. And then knowing that history makes you sure that a Black person in student debt is not in that debt because it's their own fault. It's because the policy is literally designed to be against them. So it just kind of explains a lot of things that we might think of as inevitable or the only way to operate. But if you go back and look at history, you can see that there are other possibilities for how we live today.
Yeah, and that everything was built and isn't just like it happened to be here, but it was built by a person.
Yeah, I like to ask my students how they think people in a historical time imagined the future, because it shows like how many different possibilities there were at the time. And to them, that's what they see. But I also want them to see like there are many possibilities for us now. Like there is no one direction that we're inevitably heading into. Like thing can happen. I think we're definitely in like a paradigm shift almost that people are struggling against and struggling to like see paths forward. But like in terms of, I think, the growing internet and like powers of AI and all those sorts of things, like we as a society have to kind of navigate paths forward that there's like a bazillion ways to think about that and to imagine the future.
Yeah, really. Thank you, Meredith, for joining. Do you have anything that you wrote down that you didn't get to talk about?
I wanted to talk about how not everyone agreed with secession at the time of secession. Like, literally, militias were parading around in South Carolina in 1860 trying to intimidate their little yeoman farmer friends to vote in favor of secession because, like, they didn't have enslaved people, so why would they vote to preserve the rights of slaveholders? So, like, there was tons of sectional strife even within the Confederacy at the time. I wanted to talk more about how terrible the Civil War was. Like, literally just so terrible. Like, there's no way for us to, as people in 2023, to even for a moment wrap our heads around how terrible it was. Like, when I read 2 pages of my book about death in the Civil War, I have nightmares. It's really traumatizing. And
what kind of fighting happened?
What do you mean?
Like what kind of guns and what kind of
Okay.
like was it like everyone line up and start shooting? What was the deal?
Civil War happened at a very weird moment in military history. Not a military history expert, but because it happened during this shift in technology, but not a shift in military tactics, like way higher levels of death occurred because people were still like running at each other in lines and doing this like strategic like movement of their militaries, but they had explosives and all of these like more advanced weapons that kind of appeared in World War I as well, and also did not have the medicine to deal with that. So like people
That's
just,
what I was gonna say.
yeah, like at least by World War I there was a little bit better medicine. It still wasn't that good, but like people were just dying terrible deaths, like literally corpses piled up in civilians' backyards, and they would have to bury them themselves, like because also there's no like infrastructure to deal with the dead people from the Civil War. So like then there's all this civilian trauma, then the civilians get really sick from all the disease that comes along with the army. Then there's like all of these formerly enslaved people who are running to union lines to escape freedom, or to escape to freedom, because obviously they don't want to remain on plantations, even though that seems like the only option. They like take these huge risks to go to freedom, and then they are neglected because the Union Army is fighting a war, and also most of them are racist, so they don't really care about the free people, and like babies die. Women, informally enslaved women, don't have work, they can't make money, they can't eat, they starve. Like it's just mass suffering for a really long time for a lot of people. I feel like I didn't talk enough about like the actual enslaved experience of the Civil War too, but that didn't really seem like it was as relevant to our conversation today, because we were talking more about sectional strife, and like enslaved people were more fighting for freedom and experiencing the Civil War in a completely different way as well. From the enslaved perspective, it's like a revolution for freedom. A lot of historians argue, and I agree with them, that like enslaved people themselves through resistance to slavery sparked the Civil War. And then I like mentioned this earlier, that enslaved people did not assist the Confederate cause, obviously, because they didn't believe in it, because it was based on their subjection or subjugation. And instead they're like fought in the Union Army, and some Black women also served as Union nurses. But also just like the experience of freedom was not like we remember it today. Like I'm not sure if you guys know the story of Emancipation Day. It just takes like years for enslaved people to find out that they are free, because enslavers want like try their very best to keep them enslaved. And then like once they're free too, like white enslavers and formerly enslaved people have no reference for what free work looks like. So there's this like huge struggle between those people to establish boundaries. And like it's like especially contentious between white women and Black women. Like Black women start refusing to cook for the families of these white women, and then white women like enact horrific violence on Black women who are just trying to like say, no, I'm not going to work 15 hours a day. Like it just so much change was happening that people did not know how to deal with, that it was really scary, I think, to people. No matter if the Civil War had been like a victory for you, like an enslaved person would obviously have had better outcome after the Civil War than they did before the Civil War, but it still was just like they were not set up to succeed. Just read so many books about that.
That's really interesting. I mean, not interesting. That is tragic and crazy.
Yeah, really, just like to me, shows that they were so let down. Like it was such an opportunity after the Civil War to like for Reconstruction to actually mend South, basically. And it's sad. It did do some good things. Like people could vote. That was pretty nice.
Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for listening.
Being a genius.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
Meredith.
Yay! I'm so excited. I've been really excited about this episode forever. So,
That was fun.
yeah. Everybody say thank you to Meredith.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye! And with that, it's a wrap on season 2 of How We Live Online. In this season, we've predicted. We've looked to the past and attempted to foretell a future. We've gone from the physical to the abstract, from the walls of Blockbuster to the void of Netflix, from companionship with feathered sex dolls to artificial intelligence chatbots. If the internet disappeared tomorrow, at least we would have the microfilm archive of code in the Arctic. We have stewards of the online world to thank for the preservation of evidence of Miley and Mandy's feud with Selena and Demi, and the Palm Pilot operating system to play solitaire. We've examined power. Who are the users of banking technologies like crypto? Who produces art that generates ad revenue for big business? Who makes the decisions that drive the development of new realms like Web3 and large language models? And who makes the laws, writing textbooks, barring us from abortion, and sending us spiraling towards a world of genetic imperialism? Several times we've asked ourselves how technology affects our perception of time. How has exposure to pocket computers affected the human brain? Not just our inner worlds, but our shared truths. What does it mean to grow up in a world that is increasingly dissimilar with each passing generation? Will there come a day when we can't agree on anything? And has that day already come? It's hard to think back on our predictions of the season without feeling bleak. So much of the future seems out of our control, predestined. But we've also felt inspired by so many internet archivists, librarians, historians, journalists, indie pub authors, Timnit Gebru, and so many others. If these people see a better path forward for us and the internet, then so do we. Thank you for listening and for thinking with us this season. We will be back to talk about the internet and the self on April 3rd, and we'll see you then. In the meantime, please follow us on Instagram at How We Live Online. Make sure you follow our podcast on Spotify and catch up on season 1 if you didn't get to listen. I would love it if you could send the seasons to a friend that you think will enjoy them, and mark your calendars, April 3rd.